Hello students, today's topic would be development of regional language and literature in the early medieval period. Now, before going on to my presentation, I would first like to give a brief introduction of what this paper is all about. The early medieval period, as we all know, spans a period that stretches from 750 to 1206 Common Era. This period was characterized by the regionalization of Indian culture, which began with the emergence of several regional kingdoms. Now, this period was also marked by the spread of Sanskrit throughout the subcontinent, along with the emergence of a number of regional vernaculars. These regional vernaculars had rich literary repositories of their own that sought to challenge the monopoly of the Sanskrit literature. Sanskrit had hitherto been the language of the court and the language of the elite, even as its currency was confined to a handful of the learned intellectuals. Sanskrit therefore formed the preferred language for most writing related to Brahmanical philosophy, religion, especially the Vedanta and the Mimamsa texts or the digests, as well as the normative texts and their commentaries. Significantly enough, Buddhist and Jain centers of learning also used Sanskrit quite extensively. As Sheldon Pollock has put it, and I quote him, there were two great moments of transformation in culture and power in pre-modern India. The first happened around the beginning of the Common Era, when Sanskrit, deemed hitherto as a sacred language, restricted to religious practice alone, came to be reinvented as a language for literary and political expression. The second could be located in the beginning of the second millennium, when vernacular speech forms became literary languages unto themselves, oftentimes challenging, if not replacing, Sanskrit. Linguistically, therefore, Indian literature had two main sources, Dravidian and Indo-Aryan. Culturally, however, it derived its sustenance from the religious and literary tradition as embodied in Sanskrit works, supplemented and modified by Buddhist and Jain influences, as well as by local indigenous lore. Now, speaking of Sanskrit literature, what one might say is this: Sanskrit and Prakrit happened to be the two main languages used by scholars and the laity respectively. In the Rajput period, for instance, they regained their popularity as many scholars adopted them for their literary texts. Court literature, irrespective of any region, continued to be composed in Sanskrit, with many royal courts competing for the patronage of leading poets and dramatists of the time. Sanskrit literature of this period, however, has usually been described as being pedantic, ornate, dull, monotonous, and artificial, with very little stylistic innovation. Yet, the celebrated poet Joydev's lyrical poem on the love of Radha and Krishna in his famous Gita Govinda stands out as a brilliant testimony and an exception to this rule. Sanskrit literature mostly comprised, as I have already mentioned, of philosophical commentaries, religious texts, bhanas or monologue plays, stotras or hymn compositions, story literature, and poetical anthologies. Its technical aspect included works on meter, grammar, lexicography, poetics, music, architecture, medicine, and mathematics, besides historical and epic Puranic themes that were popular in Kavya. Now, as far as royal biographies were concerned, what one can say is the growth of regional polities was often accompanied by the composition of royal biographies by several court poets. Royal hagiographers were required to establish further the legitimation of the political potentates. Sanskrit was the principal medium, at least in North India, for composing life stories or charitas of prominent political personalities. While Banu Bhatto's Harshacharita is a well-known work of this genre, Sandhakar Nondi's Ramcharit, written in Slesha, meaning having a double meaning, simultaneously tells the story of the epic hero Ram and the Pala king Rampal. Besides a few poetical works woven around quasi-historical themes or characters included Padmagupta's Nabo Sahoshanko Charito, wherein Sindhu Raj Nabo Sahoshanko of Malwa wins the hand of the princess Shashi Prabha. Bilhana's Vikramanka Deva Charita, that eulogizes the achievements of Vikramaditya VI, the Chalukan king of Kalyani, besides Hemachandra's Kumarapala Charito, which tells the story of Kumarapala, who was the king of Anhilavada, while illustrating the rules of grammar in Sanskrit and Prakrit alike. Besides, we also have Chand Bardai's Prithviraj Raso, an epic poem woven around the exploits of Prithviraj Chauhan over Muhammad of Ghor. We will talk about this subsequently as well. Kalhana's Raja Tarangini also falls under the royal biography series. It chronicles the achievements of the rulers of Kashmir from the earliest times up to the 12th century. Royal biographies also included the anonymous Nandi Kalam Bakam, a poem in some 80 stanzas that eulogizes the reign of the king of the Pallava monarch Nandi Varman III. Now, talking about Puranas, one might argue that the early medieval Puranas such as the Bhagavad Puran, the Brahma Vaivarta Puran and the Kalika Puran reflect the increasing popularity of theistic elements within the Hindu cults and laid emphasis on tirthas or pilgrimages, vratas or vows, penances, gifts and women's dharma. Besides, the Upapuranas also provide valuable information on popular beliefs, customs, and festivals, often tracing the dialogue between Brahmanical and non-Brahmanical ideas, values, and practices, which resulted in the emergence of distinct regional cultural configurations. Now, talking about Dharma Shastras, we will like to quote what A.D. Mathur has said in this context, and I quote him: Hindu law or Vyavahara emerged from the shadow of Dharma only to establish its independent identity, thus leading to an increasing formalization of law and legal procedures. Close quotation. Several important and influential Dharmashastra compilations, digests, and commentaries were written during the early medieval period. Such compilations included Chatur Bingshati Mata, which assembled the teachings of 24 lawgivers, Jimut Bahon's Babuharu Matrika, a work on procedural law, and Daibhag, which was a digest of laws on inheritance. Major commentaries include those of Medatithi, Govindaraja, and Kuluka on the Manusmriti, as well as Aparaka's and Vignaneshwara's commentaries on Jaggobalko Smriti, wherein the latter's Mitakhara became an authority on various aspects of Hindu law. Other important Dharmashastra works included Lokkhidhara's Kritya Kalpataru and Devanabhatta's Sriti Chandrika. Now, talking about Jain and Buddhist texts, one might say, most of the Prakrit works of this period are Jain texts in the Maharashtri dialect, marked as they were by artificiality and ornamentation. A few Pali texts show a strong Sanskrit influence as well. Apabhrangsha represents the last stage of the Prakrit languages, out of which there emerged the various modern North Indian languages. Apabhrangsha, thus, can be placed roughly halfway between Prakrit that preceded it and modern Indo-Aryan languages that succeeded it. Contemporary Apabhrangsha works included several texts on Jain doctrines and saints, epic poems, short stories, and dohas or couplets. Several works in Kannada, many of them associated with Jainism, were written as well, some under the royal patronage of the Rashtrakutas, the Hoysalas, and the Chalukyas. Glimpses of modern languages are traceable in Buddhist writings in Apabhrangsha as well. Buddhist writings from eastern India, moreover, show faint glimmerings of Bengali, Assamese, Moithili, Oriya, and Hindi, while Jain works reveal the beginnings of Rajasthani and Gujarati. Now, speaking of the regional languages and literature in particular, this period saw the emergence of the Bhakti preachers who made extensive use of local languages and imparted a tremendous fillip to regional literature. Adaptations of the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and the Bhagavad Gita were used regularly by these preachers. There was thus a gradual breaking away from Sanskrit and Prakrit and the eventual appearance and progression of languages such as Tamil, Kannada, Telugu, Marathi, Gujarati, Bengali, Hindi, and Oriya, along with the local dialects such as Bhojpuri, Moithili, and Magadhi, among others. Most modern Indian languages have had substantial literatures of their own, ranging over a period of 500 to 1,000 years, and in the case of the three Dravidian languages, i.e., Tamil, Kannada, and Telugu, even longer, even while all of them were permeated with a common Sanskrit heritage. Speaking of Tamil, we can say that Tamil had a literary history even older than any of the European languages save classical Greek and Latin. Tamil kavyas or epics like Manimekhalai and Silapaddikaram were written in the 9th century, and their uniqueness lie in the fact that they were more secular than religious. However, from the 6th century onwards, the religious consciousness did gather strength and momentum, bursting in a remarkable flowering of bhakti or devotional poetry of both the Alvar and the Nayanmar or Nayanar saints, and ultimately culminated in Kamban's classic Ramayan in the 9th century. The devotional songs of the Alvar and the Nayanmars, as well as the hagiographies of these saints, were thus among the important Tamil texts of the time. Now, speaking of Kannada and Telugu, what we can say is Kannada also had a fairly old and well-established literary tradition of its own that preceded Telugu in antiquity. The earliest extant classic written in Kannada was probably Kavi Raja Marga, the treatise on poetics belonging to the 9th century. While the early literature in North Indian languages were almost entirely written in verse, the Dravidian languages have always had a considerable body of prose writing, especially in the genre of Chompu, which was a mixed form of verse and prose, also familiar in Sanskrit. This form attained great distinction in Kannada between the 10th to the 12th century, especially in the hands of the three gems of Kannada poetry, namely Pampa, Ponna and Ranna. The Telugu poets Nannaya of the 11th century and Tikkana of the 13th century also employed this particular form in their rendering of the Mahabharata. Additionally, the earliest and the most important Telugu work on the Ramayan is undoubtedly Tikkana's Nirvanchanatra Ramayanam. Besides, Bashava, the founder of the Virashaiva movement, as well as his followers, embodied their teachings in a simple, unadorned prose, and their works, known as Vachanas, form a landmark in medieval Kannada literature. Speaking of Hindi, one might say that among the modern Indo-Aryan languages, Hindi, with its rich and miscellaneous heritage of literary achievement in several popular dialects, possesses one of the earliest literary records and also the earliest well-established tradition of secular writing. In the 12th century Rajasthani classic, something we just mentioned a couple of slides ago, Prithviraj Rasau by Chand Bardai, who was the court minstrel of Prithviraj, the last Hindu king of Delhi, whose exploits it narrates. The term Hindi, in fact, is used loosely to denote several Middle Indo-Aryan dialects which had evolved over a period of over 5 centuries, distinct literary forms of their own, and were known by their separate names as well, like Brojo Bhasha, Avadi, Rajasthani, Bhojpuri, Magadhi, and Moithili. The collection of mystic songs of the 10th and the 11th centuries, known as the Chaujapad, hide beneath their surface meanings esoteric doctrines, the legacy of a decadent Mahayana Buddhism with Tantric and Nath cult affiliations, which were popular religious lore across North India, having significant literary expression in several languages, including the medieval narrative poetry of Bengal, i.e., the Mongol, that celebrated the worship of non-Vedic divinities like Dharmo, Monosha, and Chondi. Marathi has given to North Indian languages their first great religious poet come thinker in Ganeshwara, whose commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, written in the 13th century, still holds an unrivaled place as a literary classic. Ganeshwara firmly established the tradition of Marathi literature in which bhakti, devotion, gyan, philosophy, and scholarship are admirably blended. Now, talking about literature as a historical tool, we might say that literary sources could offer both direct as well as indirect information about their time, and that could be seen from the anonymous Lekho Paddhati, a work in Sanskrit and Prakrit composed in Gujarat that contains models of various types of legal documents. Another example is the Krishi Porashor, an early medieval text of Bengal that deals with agriculture. Historical information can also be prized out of texts that appear apparently unhistorical or historically unimportant. For instance, Jain folk tales, the Dharmo Kathas of Western India, often have merchants as protagonists who provide useful information on trade and traders alike. Mathematical texts such as the Gonito Sharo Shongroho of Mahaviracharya and Lilaboti of Bhaskaracharya offer incidental information about prices, weights and measures, wages, and coins. Now, speaking of Shankaracharya and his Advaita Vedanta, we can say that the early medieval period saw the proliferation of philosophical writings related to the various darshanas. One of the most influential thinkers of the time was undoubtedly Shankaracharya, who lived in the late 8th and the early 9th centuries. One of Shankaracharya's most popular hagiographies is undoubtedly the Shankar Digvijay written by Madhava. The various Vedanta philosophical systems based on the Upanishads include Badarayan's Brahma Sutra and the Bhagavad Gita. The earliest formal exposition of Advaita or non-dualistic Vedanta was put forward by Gaudapada in his Mandukya Karika, a verse commentary on Mandukya Upanishad. Gaurapada's ideas were further developed by Shankaracharya, who tried to demonstrate that the Upanishads and the Brahma Sutras contained a systematic, unified philosophy. His major work is his Bhashya or commentary on the Brahma Sutra. Shankaracharya was one of the most influential proponents of Vedanta, and his version of Vedanta was called the Advaita Vedanta. Speaking of South Indian Bhakti, where we have the Alvar and the Nayanmar saints, and I quote here in this context A.L. Basham, who says, and I quote him, "The greatest glory of medieval Tamil literature is undoubtedly the hymns of the Shaivite and the Vaishnavite devotional teachers, which are among the great religious literature of the world." Close quotation. In the early medieval period, the Alvar and the Nayanmar or the Nayanar saints of South India gave a new emphasis and expression to Vaishnava and Shaiva devotionalism, one that was deeply rooted in Tamil land, language, and ethos. The roots of South Indian Bhakti can be traced to certain features in late Sangam poetry, as well as to certain elements in the Paripatai and the Pattu Pattu. For instance, a poem called the Tirumuru Karapattai, the Guide to Lord Murugan, in the latter text refers to the god Murugan by using epithets that encapsulate important episodes in his mythology. According to Zellabel, The ancestry of Bhakti poetry can perhaps be traced to the Tanipattal, the single bardic stanzas found among both Akkam and Puram poems. Besides, the settings of the heroic poems, namely the Patan, focuses on eulogizing the patron and asking him for gifts. Patan poems and bhakti songs, in fact, have an intense personal tone to them. According to tradition, there were 12 Alvar and 63 Nayanmar saints whose hymns are still sung in temples. Alvar and Nayanmar poetry reflect a devotion that is at once intimate, intense, and ecstatic. Speaking of the devotional literature of the Alvars, we have the hymns of the 12 Alvars which were collected by Nathamuni in his Nalayara Divya Prabandham, which means the 4,000 holy hymns which constituted the Vaishnava canon. The first major hagiography of the Alvar saints was a 12th century work named the Divya Suri Charitam by Garura Vahana. Friedhelm Hardy has analyzed the mythological references in the Tiruvantatis, which represent the earliest stage of Alvar religiosity and highlights the prominence of the Krishna avatar. Nambalvar's poems used the style of the older Akkam poems with a new symbolism, the relationship between devotee and the deity being described as analogous to that between the lover and his beloved. The mythology of Krishna and his association with the gopis lent itself well to an emphasis that was at once emotional and erotic. The erotic element found its fullest expression in the poems of the woman saint Kodai, who came to be known as Andal, literally meaning one who rules. Andal's poems are laced with the pangs of separation and a longing for union with her lord. Speaking of the devotional literature as composed by the Nayanmar or the Nayanar saints, now, out of the 63 Nayanmar saints, the revered trio comprising Sambandar, Appar, and Sundarar, with the latter's poem Tiru Tondar Tokai or The Assembly of Sacred Slaves, lists the names of the 62 Nayanmars. In the early 10th century, Nambi Andar Nambi wrote a work called the Tiru Tondar Tiruvantai, which means the sacred poem of the holy slaves, wherein he gave a short hagiography of these 62 Nayanmar saints, adding Sundarar's name to the list. He also collected the songs of these saints. In the mid-12th century, stories of the saints' lives were put together in a work called the Periya Puranam, which forms the 12th and the final book of the canon known as the Tirumurai. The collection of hymns known as the Tevaram is part of this larger work. In Shaiva Bhakti, the relationship between the god and his devotee is often expressed as analogous to that between a master and his slave. The poems of Manikava Chakar, in fact, frequently refer to the experience of melting before the Lord. Now, speaking of the philosophical underpinnings of South Indian Bhakti, one might say that the philosophical aspect of Alvar Vaishnava Bhakti was enunciated by Vaishnava acharyas like Nathamuni, founder of the Sri Vaishnava sect, who in his Nyaya Tattva emphasized the idea of prapatti, complete surrender to the God. Other influential Sri Vaishnava acharyas included Yamunacharya, Ramanuja, and Madhavacharya. Ramanuj wrote several works such as the Vedantoshar, the Vedartha Sangraho, and the Vedanto Deepa, as well as commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita and the Brahmo Sutra. His philosophy, known as Vishishto Advaita or qualified non-dualism, combined Vaishnava Bhakti with Upanishadic monism. Madhavacharya wrote commentaries on the Brahma Sutra and Upanishads and also wrote a work called the Bharata Tatparya Nirnaya based on the Puranas and the epics. Besides, Shiva Jnana Bodham by Mekhanda Deva contains the basic doctrine of the Shaiva Siddhanta school, which was but another popular school of Shaivism in South India. The Virashaivas, on the other hand, accepted many of the doctrines of the other Shaiva schools, but its core ideas are encapsulated in free verse lyrics known as vachanas composed by the saints. By way of conclusion, one might argue that the regionalization of Indian culture began with the emergence of several regional kingdoms. Regional languages had rich literary repositories of their own that sought to challenge the monopoly of Sanskrit literature. Linguistically, Indian literature had two main sources, Dravidian and Indo-Aryan. Culturally, however, it derived its sustenance from the religious and literary tradition as embodied in Sanskrit works, supplemented and modified by Buddhist and Jain influences, as well as by local indigenous lore. The most vital impulse that had conditioned the character of Indian literature was religious, something that was true of the entire course of its development, be it Vedic, Buddhist, Jaina, classical, Dravidian, and later Indo-Aryan, although classical Sanskrit and early Tamil literature show ample evidence of secular vigor. The most passionate as well as the most characteristic expression of this religious impulse was in devotional poetry, both narrative and lyric, inspired by one or the other form of Vaishnavism or Shaivism. Thank you.